Welcome to the Inner Alignment Podcast, a neuroscience approach to healing anxiety and depression caused by childhood trauma stored in the body. With the right tools, healing long-term anxiety and depression is completely possible when you heal at root cause. Join me as we expand boundaries in the field of trauma recovery with the revolutionary Inner Alignment System, a 6-layered approach to addressing stored trauma in every layer of the body. Hey, you guys, welcome to the Inner Alignment for Childhood Trauma podcast. I'm your host, Kim Beekman. We're going to be talking about Ayurvedic psychology today and what it's like to view your mental well-being, or if you struggle with anxiety and depression, from the perspective of your Ayurvedic constitution type. People often assume that I'm like psychic because I can listen for someone's Ayurvedic constitution and pretty much predict the issues and the patterns after about 15 minutes of talking to someone. But it's only because I understand their energetic constitution. So the issues that we run into in our relationship, our soul qualities, our shadow qualities, all of these things that make up the physics of who we are can be understood at a very deep level if we can tap into the Vedic sciences. So we're going to be diving into these concepts with you so you can understand your constitution. Today, I am joined by Rose Paull. Rose is with us, and she has been just an experienced rewiring coach and inner alignment healer. Rose's day job is in customer support for healthcare. And by night, she's an Ashtanga and Kundalini yoga teacher. And as I said, an inner alignment soul retrieval healer. She is just an incredible resource in our organization in her awareness of the Ayurvedic constitutions and the tendencies and patterns. So I'm excited to be here with you today, Rose.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here too. I think one of the fun things about this podcast talking about doshas is you get to hear Kim, who has fire, and then you'll get to hear me, who has earth. So you can hear it real time, the differences here. The amount of understanding, self-understanding and understanding that I found in my relationships from Ayurveda and the doshas is just profound. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's been so fun to watch your journey in inner alignment. And we're going to go into the details, but you live in Michigan now with your husband that you manifested through your depth of understanding in your inner alignment journey. And you have 2 stepchildren. It's like, boom, you created a family out of nowhere.
It's just been incredible to go through this process. I first learned about Ayurveda 10 years ago when I went through my first yoga teacher training. And I remember how exciting it was, but it totally kicked up another level when I started doing the inner alignment work. When I went through level 1, I got a good understanding of myself, what my patterns were, and then also what I was looking for in partners, which wasn't necessarily what I really wanted long term, but I had to release a lot of what I thought I wanted to get to where I am.
Yeah, these are fun stories. You and I have played a lot in this space. So why don't we go into the different constitutions so that we can give some of the examples and just be able to break it down so that people can follow what that even means, like to match up with someone in a way that has a constitution that's resonant with you rather than triggering to the trauma. So in Ayurvedic psychology, we are looking at the doshas very simply. So we're taking the complexity out of the equation so that it can be easily digestible. When we take on a client, we're listening to what they're saying, how they're living, what they're doing to get a sense for their constitution. So we're not Ayurvedic doctors. We're simply taking the mental and emotional tendencies and we're hearing how those tendencies have lived out in that person's life. And in doing so, we can pretty quickly be able to tell what they've come into this life or what they're living in this moment. And We break it down simply as air constitution, fire constitution, or earth constitution. So these are all in the elemental makeup of your body. So we all have a certain amount of air, fire, or earth. Now, there's a complexity here because air is actually air and ether, fire is actually fire with water, and earth is actually earth with water. But to simplify it, we're just going to say people have a dominant dosha constitution. Dosha means that which could cause disease or imbalance in the body. So everybody has a dominant dosha or two, very typically, one or two doshas or elements that are excess imbalance, where there's a lot of that element. They usually have one or two elements that are weak in their constitution that need to be fortified a little bit. And the goal is not for everybody to have the same amount of the elements. We're all going to have a different level of each element. We all have all of the elements. It's just our nature or our natural level is going to be different based on what we were born with and how stress has influenced that balance throughout life.
I think it's important to mention that Ayurveda is the sister science to yoga. It's been around for 5,000 years. This is ancient wisdom. This is nothing new that we've come up with. It's been around, it works, it's super helpful. And also, I think it's important, especially when you're talking about trauma healing, to look at that there's a potential that you could have been born one dosha, and then based on trauma or experiences, that dosha shifts or becomes imbalanced.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, and we'll give some examples of how that looks. So, for the air constitution, we're going to call these folks the birds. So, it's helpful to actually think of this nature as animal types. And it's not to be silly, but it's to simply be able to characterize. No one debates whether a bird should be on the ground or flying in the air. Like it's their nature to fly and to land in a tree, right? So we're looking at air as the bird-like nature, the fire constitution being the lion like nature, and the earth constitution being a little more bear like nature. And let's break those down a little bit, Rose. Let's look at some of the energetic, emotional, and mental typical tendencies of each of these constitutions. So starting with the bird.
Air, you've got movement. They're usually cool, dry. These are creative, expressive types. They are inspired and playful. I have a little bit of air with that playfulness that I bring to things. However, out of balance, they can show up overwhelmed, worried, fearful, anxious. Did I say that already?
Yeah. So, right, the birds usually operate from their heart. They're generally very caring and sensitive. They care about the people around them, and they move through life by following what inspires them or following what feels creative or feels expressive. And that's their gift, is that they are spontaneous, they're lighthearted, they move lightly through the world. But the downside of that is they easily get overstimulated, overwhelmed. They will go into self-doubt and then often will have concerns that, like, thoughts that loop through their head of like, oh my gosh, did I say the wrong thing? Did I do the wrong thing? Is my health okay? Is my kids' health okay? Am I going to die? Right. So when they're imbalanced, they go to that movement based anxiety, that worry and anxiety that kind of loops in their mind. And they might call that anxiety, or they'll get overstimulated in their sensitive nervous system and they will disconnect from themselves or the world and call that depression. So that's essentially what that bird type or that vata constitution might appear like on a mental and emotional capacity.
And their anger as well is usually a quick burst. But once it comes out, they're quick to forgive or forget or move past it, that movement element coming in again.
Right. So they'll get angry, but they don't hold on to the anger too long. They have such a short attention span, they'll forget that they were even angry, right?
Yeah.
Whereas the lion, the fire constitution, is more of my type. I'm lion. They have a strong will. They're very motivated and goal oriented and strategic and focused. They can be perfectionistic. And then when they're out of balance, they can be quick to anger or to even shoot into rage. They can be controlling. We can be controlling. While we're good leaders when we're balanced, we can be really not okay giving up control or not getting things right or the right way. And also, like, there's a strong mental body, like a lot more what traditionally be looked at as ego, but like a strong sense of I and a
Mhm.
strong mental body and figuring things out and being able to process things very quickly.
A lot of entrepreneurs are lions, and narcissism is such a big word now that we hear, and that is fire out of balance. Imbalanced fire shows up as narcissism.
Yeah, that's a really hot topic these days. We'll probably have our a podcast dedicated to that, right? But what we find is the lions, when they get imbalanced in the way that you just said, that they will go toward controlling a situation or thinking about just themselves because of that lion-like nature, and they won't have grounded and anchored that fire within themselves. And so they do tend to have a lot more carnage in their relationships because of that. So, the way anxiety looks for a lion is the rumination on the things that you can't control, or the people you can't control, or the situations that you can't get in your life. And then depression often looks like almost a defeat, a sense or a feeling of defeat because you just can't get the world to shift in the way that you want it to shift. So that's typically how anxiety and depression might show up for a lion.
And anger shows up as a lot of blaming outside of themselves.
Yeah, lions love to blame other people for their current circumstances and their current emotional state. That's a great point. Yeah, lots of blame. And if someone is part bird and lion, because that combination exists, then they'll blame themselves. That self doubt plus blame is self blame and self punishment. That's how that'll show up, which is what will often drive people to addiction because it's kind of hellish to live in that space of self-punishment for the bird lions. And then there's Earth.
Earth is slow and steady, easygoing, kind, forgiving, loyal, consistent. Out of balance, they can get stuck. They can get greedy. There's some resentment that shows up for them, entitlement. They hate change. And they are very focused on their relationships. Relationships are important to them. Family, friends, events centered around food and comfort. Earth loves comfort. And they have a good memory, they have a good stamina, but it takes a little while to get them going. But once they're going, they keep going. And anxiety for Earth looks a lot like freezing and numbing. Like they can't compute, shut down. And anger for Earth is resentment and entitlement. It's a stuffing down of the anger rather than expressing it that you might see in someone with air constitution. And then depression, usually they get sad and hopeless.
Yeah, like Eeyore style of like stuck and will go into just kind of shutting down in that hopelessness that they
And
get
they're
stuck.
already kind of Eeyore. Like you can tell I have a pretty monotone voice that's pretty common with Earth constitution. And I'm excited to be here. You just can't tell.
It's true. You had to actually bring a lot of fire to show up at a podcast because one thing that Earth doesn't do is they don't think and speak on their feet. They usually have to kind of simmer with something for a few days. And so that fiery ability to kind of interact is not typical of an Earth. And most of society kind of works in that way, whereas Earth is kind of slow and steady. They'll move in, they'll find a pleasurable space, usually around family or friends and food. And they're good at holding this space. So, the gift of Earth typically is that they're good at sustaining relationship. They really care about their relationships. They don't typically have a tendency to express anger because they don't in any way want to compromise their relationships. So, they'll really bury the anger. And when they bury the anger, it kind of percolates into a deep resentment and a feeling like, because they're the givers in their relationship, they're like, why isn't anyone giving to me? They should be giving to me because I give to them. And they assume that the physics of their generosity is the physics that should be given back. But they often will set their whole life and all of their relationships up as they're the giver, and they never actually condition themselves to learn how to receive.
They're also very passive aggressive. And so I'm married to someone with Earth, and you can imagine how how our communication goes at times.
Like no one's actually saying what they feel in the moment.
Right.
It just gets buried and kind of comes back through the through these side channels, right?
Yeah. But
That's awesome.
when we do communicate to clear things up, and Tony mentioned this a couple weeks ago, he was like, I love how calm we approach it. We don't yell at each other. And I was like, Tony, it's because we're both Earth. We don't have it in us to yell at each other.
Right. And we've seen a lot of Earth people stay with each other for like 20 years, allowing the issues to fester because they don't have a tendency to speak their truth. They don't have a tendency to get angry or get frustrated and address things head on. Where if there's not wisdom about that, they'll just kind of let a problem stay. And then one day someone will wake up and be like, okay, I can't do this anymore. So that's where now that kind of gives us a segue to the ability to actually create balance within our tendencies. So everybody has either one, two dominant dosha types, which is the air, fire, or earth. And then what we want to do is look at where are we weakest or what do we not have a lot of. So as a lion with some air, with some bird in me, my work is to develop earth in my constitution, more grounding, more steadiness, more ability to be loyal and easeful and easygoing and all those steady qualities because I'm like a fireball that's like saying something before I think about it, right? So grounding and cooling my temper is what my work is, and developing that earth and that stability within my thoughts, within my emotions, within my energy. When I get flamed up in Southern California in August and September, cooling myself. So fire needs cooling and grounding. And knowing that about myself, I can work to strive to build a life that creates balance in my elements, in my dosha balancing. Whereas someone like you who has a lot of earth and you have some air, your work is to develop more fire, to speak your truth, figure out what you desire, be able to articulate that, become more strategic in life. But a bear will never be a lion, and a lion will never be a bear. And so, knowing our nature and getting ourselves to be the most expressive bear, decisive and expressive bear, or the most grounded lion is what the work is so that we can create more balance within ourselves and within our relationships.
Not only do we find these elements within us, but also times of day, seasons, the menstrual cycle, like it's just everywhere.
Do you want to share about what season is what is has that strong element?
I do. So I'm in Michigan right now. We are in fall. We're in Vata season, air season, and you feel the wind pick up and it's getting cooler. And Most of the times, myself included, maybe we get a little bit more spacey, forgetful, things feel overwhelming. And then going into winter, mid to end of winter is Earth season. And I certainly find myself during Earth season wanting to hunker down and hibernate. I don't want to do anything. I don't want to get out of bed. I just don't want to do anything. I want to snuggle up and be cozy and comfortable. And then summer, which you might have already guessed, is fire season. And I do find myself in fire season, I can get overheated or irritated quicker than normal. But, and I feel like this is pretty collective, there's also that motivation to do more. There's more doing in summer, going out and walking, going to events, barbecues, whatever it is that you like to do. So
Yeah.
it all show up for me.
So for you, with air and earth going into air and earth season, for example, that's going to create the tendency to be ungrounded and to contract, which which would give you more of what you already have. And so for you, you probably need a lot of extra self-care to build the inner fire, like the fire to get out of bed and maybe have some movement or some exercise, or the fire to motivate yourself in a certain way, right? So that air and earth season require you to build the element that's least strong within you, because it's not as accessible through the sunshine or the warmth or everybody else being super extroverted, which is typically what probably brings you into a more fiery sense. So, what does your self care look like to make sure that the bear doesn't hibernate too much or contract too much, such that people might have a tendency to go into depression or go into a lack of motivation or feel a sense of just more hopelessness or loneliness? Those are things that a bear could feel if they allow themselves to contract too much in the winter.
I have a daily practice of meditation. Now, when we get into months where I'm affected more and can go into those places of hibernating, I know it's important to add movement and heat. So, Earth generally likes to strength train. They don't really like to sweat. They don't want to break out, you know, too much exercise, too much movement. So cardio is so helpful in building up some inner fire and momentum because, like we said earlier with Earth, once they get going, they can keep going. It's just
Yeah.
getting going. And it's been so interesting the last month. I haven't worked out regularly. I just haven't had the motivation. My motivation has been elsewhere. And at the same time of knowing what it is you need, it can also be as easy as making that decision. Last week, I set up a schedule for myself. Okay, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I'm working out. I need this movement. I need this fire. It's dark out more than it's light out. I need this. And I did
Yeah.
it.
That's beautiful, Rose, that you can make the decision and do that. Like, for our clients that come in and they're depressed and we notice, oh, there's a kapha or an earth imbalanced in their constitution, being able to bring that heat and that movement, both warmth, that heat or that fire, and the movement of the body, is going to be the thing that makes them feel alive again, or makes them feel like juiced up and less depressed. And so that's not a one size fits all necessarily for all the constitutions, but for anybody with earth and earth imbalance who struggles with depression, getting up before 6 a.m. and doing some cardiovascular that pumps the blood through the body and brings fire into the constitution is going to be the difference between feeling depressed and not feeling depressed if there's not childhood trauma. So we're talking about with the exception of childhood trauma in there. And that's a really important piece. Like, when we have someone come in kapha imbalance, our first thing that we're doing is we're bringing fire and movement through their breath, through their breathing practices, and we're bringing fire and movement into their physical body so that they can start to get that momentum back of feeling alive in their body. And it works generally every time. Now, coinciding with that, we're getting into the childhood trauma that tells them they're worthless, or that they're unloved, or that they've been abandoned, right? So all of those trauma packets concurrently need to be worked. But as we work with the energetic layer of the body, by stimulating that dosha with more fire and more movement, which is what the bear doesn't really have much of, easily accessible to anyway. That is what kind of restarts and reignites the imbalanced bear. Yeah, so we talked about the breathing for someone with earth in their constitution. They're going to want to do something stimulating that brings heat and a lot more movement into their energetic and their physical body. Whereas those of us who are lions, we have a lot of fire, we have a lot of heat, we have a lot of movement, right? So our work is to cool and ground. So someone who's a pure lion is going to need to cool and ground, especially during the summer, during those heated months. That's typically when we'll start to go into inflammation or get fiery or get overly angry. And so that kind of looks like a nice grounding slow breath, like a 6 count breath in, a 6 count breath out, or even an 8 count breath out, to just slow down and activate the parasympathetic nervous system. And that grounding will also translate into what they should be doing. Now, lions love doing hot yoga, and they're running their Ironman or their triathlons, which is fine because they're like working dogs that need to like burn off some of that. But in their spare time, their work is to ground and get steady. And so a nice yin yoga practice, or something that's going to ground them, slow them down, and calm their nervous system out of all that fiery, biting energy and into a more calming, present moment, easeful state, which at first drives them crazy. So if they're at 100 miles an hour, you have to kind of step them from 100 miles an hour to 90 to 80 right? Because if you take them to 0 miles an hour, they're going to want to like poke themselves in the eyeball with a fork. But if you start to ramp them into a more slower space and help them see their identity outside, like within themselves, and not associated with what they're doing, what they're performing, who they're performing for. And that's an important psychological aspect for the lion type, because we confuse ourselves with our results or our career or what we do or how good of a parent I am. And that identity drives us and gets us away from our inner connection with ourselves.
What's interesting about the different doshas and how they show up for the practices is Earth will show up and do it because there are people counting on them to do it. And fire will show up to do it just as another task that they have to complete in their list. And air will sometimes show up to do it, sometimes not, but mostly they want to do their own thing.
It's true. And well, let's go there. But that's an important nuance in this, which is that if we're not honoring our nature and we put a bunch of rules in place about how we should be living our lives, but we set those expectations without an understanding of our nature, we can create tons of imbalance and dissatisfaction and unhappiness in our lives and find ourselves 20 years down the road depressed and disconnected. And so that's the value of understanding these doshas and these constitutions, because if we understand our nature, we can at least work within the context of the nature. So the bird's work, the air work is to ground and heat. So often that'll look like an ujjayi breath, like a grounding but warming breath to ground the nervous system. And their work, because they're moving all the time, they do a lot, but they don't really get a lot done. The bird constitution. There's a lot of doing, and they're in a lot of places, but nothing actually gets completed very often because they love the ideas, they love the processes, they love to start things, but the whole execution and finishing them can be challenging for a bird. So their work is to ground and build fire. And so that might look like working to complete one task before starting the other tasks. You see how that's like building fire and persistency to be able to complete something. While at the same time, understanding their nature is not to complete things and to put themselves in more situations that are idea generating or creativity generating that don't have to do with actually having to get a lot of things done.
And they benefit from structure, which most of them really don't want.
It's true. They
Um,
need rhythm, but they hate feeling trapped by
yeah.
a schedule, right?
Yeah, I used to travel for work and I would get into a routine. It had enough, I got to the point where it had enough structure where it wasn't too destabilizing because air in the Constitution can get destabilized by traveling. And then I started working from home about 2 months ago, and that had no structure. And I felt lost for like a month. That's why I didn't work out. I didn't do anything. I just I didn't have it.
Well, that's a good point because typically, because birds will feel trapped in a 9 to 5 job, they'll want the freedom. And then when they create the freedom, they don't have the discipline, the self discipline to create the structure to actually complete things. And so it does feel like they're in resistance either way. So that's why building that fire of self discipline is important. So, in that beautiful example of like working from home, that means you're going to need the fire within yourself to create the rhythm. Now, luckily, you have some earth, so you do have that ability to create consistency in the way that you do things. But someone who's pure bird, we might recommend to release their resistance or at least find a 9 to 5 job that has structure and rhythm so that they can show up in it and then be able to leave it, because otherwise they'll struggle in developing that infrastructure within their own life. So instead of feeling trapped or victimized by the structure, to have reverence for it and to be able to use it in the way that can be helpful for the bird. And that kind of gets to the childhood trauma as well, because, birds love freedom and they love having space. They want freedom and space. That's what birds want most in life. But there's this whole adulting thing that we have to do, like getting a roof over our head or maintaining relationships and being consistent or working so that we can pay the bills. And birds don't like the whole adulting thing. It's like ruffles their feathers too much. And so building that fire to be able to be consistent, to be able to ground into the reality of what it requires to do the adulting, while honoring that it's hard for a bird and it's not going to come as easily as it would for a lion.
It's that delicate balance of working any shadow qualities or doshic imbalances that are coming up and releasing your resistance to them.
Yeah, so that's a great segue, Rose, to like the soul qualities and the shadow qualities. It's really trendy these days to hear people talk about their shadow work, right? And the way that we do shadow work and inner alignment is very much based on these elemental tendencies. What we find is, especially for people that have like two elements, to like air and fire, for example, what we find is that typically there's parts of themselves that they're in resistance to or that they don't like about themselves. And when they get imbalanced in their life, they see more of these qualities and they go into resistance with that part of themselves, and they either judge themselves, or they don't like it, or they are like their mother's qualities and they're like just not able to accept that part of themselves. But that basically makes them go into separation from themselves. And what we find is that typically all those shadow qualities that that person is resisting within themselves is an element that's out of balance. And so to be able to look at that more objectively as like, oh, I'm, being short tempered and I'm not easy to pin down and I'm always overwhelmed and I'm feeling like, I just can't get enough space and I can't be consistent in my life. Like those are all shadow qualities, but that's also imbalanced air in the constitution. And so those shadow qualities are essentially just the part of ourselves, that part of the element that hasn't been grounded or strengthened or brought back into balance. And that's important for us to know about ourselves so that we can be able to say, oh, my air got imbalanced. Maybe I need to do some grounding to bring myself back into the soul qualities of being creative and being spontaneous and being able to go with the flow in life and explore things, right? So, to balance ourselves and to see the shadow that's showing up as simply as, oh, one of my elements got imbalanced and I need to do the work to get them back to a balanced state.
And it's the flip side. You wouldn't have the balance without the imbalance. So it's all of it, and making room for all of it is important in order to release that self-judgment, find acceptance within yourself. But then once you do that, you can bring it out into the world with the people around you. And that transforms things.
Yeah, it does transform things because then what people get stuck in is if we are in any way not accepting the part of ourselves and we are in a relationship where someone is in resistance to that part of ourselves, it can start to amplify the imbalance or that issue even further in life. And
I
so,
can speak to this.
yeah, please do.
I had a tendency of dating fiery men. I admired their drive, their high profile jobs, a few were doctors, and I got swept up in it, in their drive and that admiration towards them. But when you find someone who's fiery and their focus is their job, relationships and connection aren't as important to them, and certainly not as important to someone who has earth like me. So connection, relationships, very important to me. So I'm chasing after these guys with fire, and I have an overattachment shadow quality. And I think of her as this green gremlin with lipstick all over her face and just batting her eyelashes like, come love me. And no one with fire wants that over attachment. And I mean, it's a lot. So once I was able to pinpoint that shadow quality within myself, but also these doshic qualities that I was looking for in men, it was kind of game over. I remember I believe I was in level 3, so I'd spent maybe around a year or so with you, Kim. And I was texting you. I'd been in and on and off again. I can't even call it a relationship. I was just overly attached to this guy who sometimes wanted to date and sometimes didn't. And you said this is a pattern. You can continue to play it out or you cannot. And that day, I I decided I didn't want to play it out anymore. And it felt like a part of me died. And I mourned that whole night. But the next day I woke up 100 times later. And 2 weeks later is when I actually met Tony. So it was just wild and crazy and powerful.
Yeah, isn't that fascinating? So, like, if I try that on, it was like you were attached to the fire in the other person so much that, and those relationships never worked because you were attached to it, kind of coming from outside of yourself. Right? It was juicy for you to be around all that fire because you don't have that type of fire. And it usually showed up it ended in a toxic relationship pattern or in them being unkind to you and you kind of dealing with it in a more passive way. I don't want to say your truth. Would you say that's what happened?
That's accurate. Yeah.
Yeah. So then when we could see that a few times and just be like, huh, this happened again. Huh, that happened again. that happened again. That was when all that data, and we always say this in inner alignment, just getting that data of the pattern allowed you to be like, more consciously, do I want that? Is this a pattern that serves me? Because you had been generally single for quite a number of years, stuck in this relationship pattern, right?
Yeah. I probably within the span of a decade, maybe dated one person seriously, but I would casually be dating someone and the overattachment would come in. And in the longer term relationships, the overattachment would show up as jealousy and entitlement. And I it's like almost not even logical looking
It's
back
not,
at
but it
it
is
now.
doshic.
Right.
It is your constitution. Like that's the shadow aspect of earth of like, I want that. I should get it. Look at how much I'm giving you. Look at how much attention I'm giving you. How can I not get that same attention or whatever it is that you were going for? But, can you zoom in a little bit on what happened once you had that recognition? Like, so then you were able to see it like, oh, yeah, I'm doing that everywhere. And that's why my relationships aren't working anymore.
And I also wanted to point out that it's not like that shadow quality, that imbalance went away. I had just through the help of inner alignment was able to rewire in a new pattern. And each time it got a little easier.
What was the new pattern that you had to rewire in once you saw what you were doing?
I did a lot of energetic releasing and a lot of meeting myself. Okay, what is it that I'm looking for, that I'm craving, and how can I drum that up inside me?
Right. So the striving to meet that need within self then allowed you through law of attraction to be able to attract someone who could see your value and see your wholeness and see like who you are and what you bring. And it was so cool how quickly that happened. It was like that issue shifted for yourself and then boom, like, I mean, not that you weren't actively using intention to draw that person into your life. And we're going to have to pick that up when we do inner alignment and manifestation as a topic. You'll have to come back and do that with us. And you'll have to come back and talk about doshas and relationships. Those are two areas that will be really fun to workshop and play. But like your ability to see, going into the awareness layer of your body, to see, oh, I'm looking for him to bring this spark or this juice. I need to be my own juice. I need to see my own worth. I need to be that person for myself. And once that locked in and you were able to rewire that in your body, that is when, through the law of resonance, Tony was able to slip into your life. And actually, you had the inclination to go move back to Michigan from Maine. You settled there, and very shortly after that, he showed up, and like your life just went into the trajectory that you knew you wanted and you knew was meant for you, but you kept running into that resistance based on that blind spot of how you were trying to balance your constitution outside of yourself, finding those fiery men rather than building that self-worth inside of yourself.
And I think what's even more fascinating and fun, if you choose to spin it this way, but so those shadow qualities, that pattern isn't necessarily gone. Sure, I've manifested a great partner, but now I'm a step parent, and that you're giving, you're giving, you're giving, and there's not a whole lot of return immediately. So when they start crying because they miss their mom, I need to be steady in myself that, it's not because they don't love me or I suck. It's they miss their mom, and that's okay. So the work is still there, just in a very different way.
Right. So maintaining your worthiness in the space of the kids wanting someone else and not going into the spiral or into what we call the pain body, as Eckhart Tolle calls it, not going into the pain body of abandonment or unworthiness or not being loved or wanted, but staying in the strength of your worth when they're struggling so that you can be there for them and be the best and most grounded, worthy step parent that you can be. And that does take strength and fire and the knowing of who you are in the space of that pain body that will kind of swoop in and take over your thoughts or your emotions at any given moment. So thank you for naming that. It's like the core work was had then locked in, but it's your work to keep that rewiring practice in place to stay in the steadiness, because our tendency will be to go where our dosha, where our element will take us. So thanks for bringing that up. That kind of ties together what those daily practices do for us. It brings us into our inner work each morning so that we can start the day from a place of awareness and consciousness and from a place of balance within our body, so that when we hit those types of situations, we don't go hook, line, and sinker into that old vibrational pain body. So I think you and I could probably talk forever about this stuff. For
I was
example,
just thinking
in
about a million
relationships.
things we didn't cover.
I know we just scratched like the first few bullets of what we wanted to cover. So you'll have to come back here and we need to dig right in again into the spaces of relationships. But let's just kind of give some teasers of what we see. Like when they're, when you're parented, let's say you're a bird and you were parented by a lion. What gets installed in the neurosynaptic, the neurocircuitry of who I am and what I should be, and all of those thoughts and expectations will be lion thoughts installed in a bird body. And so we often will see people with lion thoughts and beliefs and expectations that were from when they were growing up, but they'll have a bird constitution, and it often will create a lot of resistance, and it will create a lifetime of misalignment with themselves. So being able to know your constitution, or if you're a lion and you feel like you should be laid back and chill like the bears in your life, and you're just kind of like fired up and angry all the time, right? Or if you're a bear and there's so many people that are creative and expressive, and you just find yourself listening but not really expressing very much, you might feel like there's something quote unquote wrong with you. But these constitutions and the way that we're raised and conditioned, if our dosha is different than that of a parent, the dominant parent, especially in the family, then we will grow up with a belief that there's something wrong with us or something broken with us, because what is our natural inclination will be different than what our parents or society says we quote unquote should feel, do, or be in a given scenario or situation.
Or even look like, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. We didn't even talk about that because the bird body is going to be like tall and lanky. The lion body is going to have more natural muscle and maybe kind of stocky in that like square muscle type. And the kapha is going to have more fat on their body naturally. They're supposed to have that fat on their body. So in that example, if someone's kapha, if someone's earth constitution, and they're looking out into society and they're all birds and lions in society, they're going to be like, what, my body is wrong, my body is bad, I shouldn't have a body that looks like this, when they very well should have a body that looks like a bear and is more resilient than any of the other birds or lions out there, because the gift of that earth on their natural earth body is it's a very resilient, self-sustaining, strong immune system body. Whereas the birds are injuring themselves. They don't have that stability in their body, and they're wishing that they weren't injuring themselves when they went to pickleball, or they're wishing that their nervous system felt more grounded and less sensitive in daily life. So, yeah, we'll often wish that we have that which we don't, but that's for us to build, right?
And lions over there dealing with inflammation and fevers.
Yeah, like they'll overheat and that'll show up as like acne, or it'll show up as skin issues or inflammation in the lungs or bronchitis, or different types of inflammation will show up because that's what fire might look like, or diarrhea will show up. So, yeah, there are many different physical, mental, and emotional and energetic thought tendencies for each of these constitutions, and they look and act differently. It will show up very often in their relationships. So I do all of the couples work within the Inner Alignment organization. So I have had the privilege to work with hundreds of couples. And in doing so, when I get into a couple session, I would say 75% of the issues facing couples is someone projecting their constitution on their partner who is a different constitution. So, like myself, Vata Pitta, in a relationship with someone who's earth, right? So I might project kind of my thoughts or my beliefs or my worldview on that earthy person. And they're like, dude, I'm a bear. Like, I got only bear for you. I can't be a bird and a lion. But because they don't know that, that's their nature, they're just like, oh, I must be wrong. There must be something wrong with me. Right. And so that blame, let's say the fiery blame, is being put on them. But when they both get an understanding of what their nature is and what their nature is always going to revert back to, it's like the veil gets lifted and they can finally see each other as who they are in their nature. And it's like they can readjust their expectations. They can readjust these, like, you always want to move and I feel like you're not present to me. Well, a bird is always going to move. And so being able to adjust themselves to be able to accept the other person's nature clears up about 75% of the issues in the relationship. So that's critical in being able to move through life with certain level of self-understanding, and then to be able to lead that into our relationships so that we can start to build that understanding, whether we're at work or we're with our kids or with our partners or with our friends. So thank you, Rose, for being willing to dive into this and to explore these things and to live this work, because I know that you bring this into your work. Like when you were doing active MRIs on people, you would like really start the conversation and what you would like riff on Ayurveda with them, wouldn't you?
It's just fun. It's a different way to look at things, and it's so profound and a gift.
It's true. And what it does is it builds compassion. So I have a spiritual teacher who once said, compassion is love plus understanding. And the Ayurvedic psychology of human dynamics is so consistent. Like people's doshas will have just very predictable patterns. And it gives us a way to understand what's going on. And when we understand people, we don't expect them to be different. We can start to work with their nature. And that is a more compassionate world. It's just a more compassionate existence. And what was cool for me, having three daughters, is I learned this when they were very young. So I just naturally would talk to them. I'm like, well, that friend doesn't really interact very much when she's having a sleepover because she's Earth and she's just kind of chill and she's more laid back. And so don't expect her to entertain you the whole time. She's just going to be a good listener. And she's, these are going to be her gifts. Or that vata imbalanced friend, that air imbalanced friend, is not going to be able to pay attention to you, and she is going to switch the subject, and she is going to be moving and playing, and so she's going to be the friend that you can just move and create with, and may not be the person that sits and talks for hours and listens and holds space for you. And in doing that, in each of these situations of just helping them understand the dosha of the person that they were butting up against, what it turned out as is, as teenagers, they'll be in their friend groups and someone will start talking about another person, and my daughter will be one of the people who's like, dude, that's just how they roll. They're air, they're just going to be overwhelmed, they're going to have anxiety, they're going to kind of switch things up and, go through many boyfriends, and that's just their nature. And we don't have to judge her, but we can help her. We can just let her know and reflect that to her and talk to her about it, but not expect that she's wrong or bad because of those tendencies. And she's now taught one of my daughters has taught a number of her friends to be able to see each other from this elemental perspective. And what it is built is a great deal of understanding and non-judgment, of just being able to be with people and their tendencies. And I think that's why I share this publicly and freely everywhere, any chance I can. Like I teach for free for Ayurvedic psychology through yoga teacher trainings. I will put this in podcasts. I put it in all of my books that I've written, because it's so important for me that people start to build their understanding of humanity so that life can make more sense and they can bring themselves back into balance in a way that truly honors themselves and releases their own self-judgment. So thank you. Thanks for coming. Thanks for doing it. Thanks for shifting your consciousness, Rose, and being willing to bring this out into the world. I'm so grateful. And you do it in such a fun way that really, I feel like, helps people understand themselves without the self-judgment. So thanks for being here. And I can't wait to dig into these topics more with you.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to today's Inner Alignment podcast. If you're ready to dive deeper into your anxiety or depression healing process, learn more about our 2-month Inner Alignment healing program. The healing program addresses trauma on all 6 layers of the body, and the program has been successful for over 400 participants. If you're feeling ready to join the community of healers who provide this sacred and profound healing work in the world, maybe it's time to become an Inner Alignment practitioner. If you think this is your dharma or your life purpose, be in touch. Find out more at KimberlyBeekman.com.